zoning maps, zoning ordinances, coordinating planning efforts, and everything else on the list.
The only other thing I'd say about duties, right, is that oftentimes it's not the commission's responsibility to actually prepare
yeah,
those documents, right? Or staff sometimes is maybe doing minor modifications to your zoning code or something like that. But oftentimes consultants will prepare and have a discrete task to do these types of responsibilities.
Yeah, that's a good point. So as you know, it's not the planning commission who's coming up with the new zoning ordinance yourself, right? Or the housing element yourself, but it does come to you for review.
Right. Quick question. So for because this happened, this came up last meeting, the CIP. Our role within the CIP is very limited, in my opinion, right? It's designed for us to make sure that the CIP is in alignment with the general plan. That's it. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, it is, right? And so, for example, oftentimes when you have a conversation related to capital infrastructure planning activities and how the city might want to spend its money on investing in, say, a water line or a sewer line,
Right.
Having a water line or a sewer line maybe be inconsistent with your planning documents is where you would be able to step in and say, hey, why are we spending $5 million to spend a new water line going on the west side of town when we're talking about all of our planning that we've been investing on the east side of town? So that correlation of land use planning and infrastructure is exactly what you guys are doing.
Yeah, and the reason why I bring it up is because it was listed as one of our duties, but unlike some of the other items listed on there, it's a much, much narrower focus. And I wanted to make sure that members of the public didn't think we had the ability to say, I'll use the example of, there's 10 things, right? And they're ranked 1 through 10 in importance, right? It's not our role to move number 10 up to number 1 because we believe that's more important.
That's right. That's right. Your role in that conversation is to identify whether there'd be any inconsistencies within that plan, right? And how your planning and policy documents are laid out. So that when the recommendation goes to your city council, it's clear, look, it's been developed, the planning commission feels that it's in a good position, and then you made a recommendation to your city council.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, but just to piggyback on what was just said. So when these things come before us, we as a body certainly can make a comment, have a comment, or ask the planning department to re-review. In other words, I understand that a lot of this is coming down from the state.
Yeah.
I get it. But in your municipalities, I know about Lafayette, people are going to question, and they should question. And so this body will always question whether it's in writing and it's coming from Sacramento or not, so that it's part of the record.
For sure. And actually, I
Right?
think that's a great planning process. Like
Yeah.
oftentimes, we'll participate and facilitate conversations between planning commissions and the public. And commission members might spend 30 minutes with staff before the meeting asking questions to try to get answers.
Yeah.
And they'll answer their question perfectly. But for the impetus of the public record to make sure that they understand what is taking place and what the implications are, they might reiterate that question in the same discussion forum to make sure that everybody understands what's going on. And that's exactly what should take place.
Exactly.
But I do think there's a balance there, right? Because there's making sure that your meetings maybe aren't as so long that people don't engage, or maybe they're like, oh, wow, this is taking 4 hours, and I thought it was going to be 20 minutes. But also making sure that people feel informed is incredibly important.
It's really important. Yeah, and that they understand, right? That's really, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll cover that when it comes to kind of roles and responsibilities. I see Eric turned his light on.
I just real quick through the chair, because that's fresh in everyone's minds from the last meeting. I think the commission is raising some really good points about that. I would just say on that item specifically, it is a fairly narrow focus and it's pursuant to state law, but it's also super critical because without that determination of consistency, the council can't consider the CIP adoption. So what took place at the last meeting was fine in terms of the questions and the comments, but the action in terms of determining that conformance was super important in order to get the final document approved.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up. I view it, my interpretation of it is that it's the one role where we have a much more limited role than anything else that comes before us.
Right. So the role, the commission's role in terms of the CIP itself, doesn't have anything to do with setting project budgets, project priorities, project timelines, but in terms of finding consistency with the general plan, very important, and that is the commission's role for sure.
And ideally, just to chime into Eric's point, the reason why it's limited is because the CIP which was prepared was probably very inherently consistent with your general plan. You're the checkpoint to make sure that maybe Public Works isn't deciding to build a road to nowhere, right? That isn't consistent with the general plan.
Okay, great.
And so this conversation actually ties to the next slide, which the role of the planning commissioner and item number 2 is to assure that the general plan is implemented. So again, the general plan is kind of your go-to, your Bible, in quotes, that when a project comes in front of you, no matter if it is CIP or if it's a development application or, the general plan or housing element that's in front of you, your role as a planning commissioner is to review that item per its consistency with the general plan.
The only other thing I'd add to this one is just simply that it is a case-by-case decision, right? And I think that that is incredibly important, and that you each have your own independent voice related to making a decision related to the item in front of you. Oftentimes, community members or communities in general think that, oh, everything's got to be unanimous. It's great that you all get along, but you all don't have to have the same opinion.
Yeah, I can share a personal experience recently on a project. Commissioners had different opinions, and there were findings, obviously, that had to be made. And while everyone had different findings that they could and could not make, overall, a project either gets approved or denied. But even if a couple of people vote no and a couple of people vote in favor, you're allowed to have your own interpretation of the findings and of the general plan. Everything doesn't need to be unanimous.
That's well put.
So creation process. So the Planning Commission participates in the development. We've been talking about this a few times now. The general plan, housing element, zoning code. You're also responsible for facilitating community engagement, right? So study sessions, public forums, community meetings, listening to what the community has to say, opening the public comment period, hearing the public comments. To Trevor's point earlier, and also to Commissioner Sparling, that oftentimes I, as a planning commissioner, I'll go to my planning staff before a meeting, ask questions, but then if there's a public comment that we've received, let's just say a concern about noise, right, for a given development application, I will make a point to ask a question in the record so that the community can feel heard, that the noise item is something that the commissioners are aware of and that the commission is hearing. So the approval amendment process, again, Planning Commission reviews the general plan, housing elements, specific plans, and for the long-range planning applications, they're all referred to City Council. Some development applications are also referred to City Council, specifically for a land use amendment. And then, yeah, next slide. I think we could, these are all kind of the same.
Yeah, the only reason I'd bring this one up is just simply related to the implementation of architectural and design review, which is a function in which you also hold as your planning commission for the city of Brentwood. And so not only is it a policy decision of consistency, but also maybe a preference decision related to appearance. And the detail related to appearance and design style, oftentimes you might have an applicant propose a particular style. Let's just say it's Santa Fe Mission or something like that. But you're like, wow, we really want California Cottage. And that type of feedback at that level is really what is beneficial to this process, right? It isn't necessarily, I don't really like the 6-inch spacing on the picket fence. Maybe it should be 8-inch spacing, right? That is a little bit too much in the weeds. Think of how do I influence an outcome rather than influence a feature, I think is a great way to think about it. So in to be effective, and most of you have, as you voiced in your introductions, have very professional jobs. And oftentimes, the interaction in this forum feels very familiar, whether it's a board meeting or an interaction with colleagues, but it has a different tone. And part of it is structural in that there is an interaction and a cadence and discourse, which is required through our public statute to have a certain formality to it, which is why, and we have a member of our public, but we wouldn't necessarily allow that member of the public to stand up and just start speaking on an item, right? And part of that is because when there is multiple opinions in the room, we need to make sure that we understand and can control the conversation to a way that we can get to an outcome. So as a role of your planning commission responsibilities, it is a unique position, right? You not only represent your own knowledge and basis to try to help inform the community to make the best decision possible, but in theory, you're also hearing from your neighbors, the constituents that you know, the people that are at the soccer game or at the community church function or whatever the network is that you have in the community. It is absolutely encouraged to bring those facets and those opinions into the room so that the community understands everything that's influencing the outcome.
Yeah, and I'll just add that commissioners are selected for the planning commission for a reason, right? Your background, your perspective, how long you've lived in your city changes your perspective, right? If you've raised children in the community, if you own a business in the community. So it is a very, very important role being on the planning commission, offering the different perspectives.
What I would say is that there is multiple case law in California that actually shows that the public in these forums has something called a privileged position. And so if you look at that as one of your responsibilities is to help inform them so that they understand what decisions are being made, that is the best outcome that you could have. Whether they agree with it or not, if they understand what it is you're doing, that is the primary purpose of one of these boards and bodies.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Going back to the last slide, where we're talking about communicating and educating the public, we'd like to do that more than we're actually able to due to Brown Act restrictions. So, for example, my primary means of communicating with the public, it happens to be social media, and yet I can't really be active on social media if more than one other commissioner might see what I'm writing, because there are very specific restrictions. So it makes it difficult, and it's also important that when we do address the public, that we educate, here is what it is, but we don't offer opinions that might indicate to some other interested party that we've formed an opinion on their application before considering it. So it makes it a little difficult.
It's a slippery slope. Yeah, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah, so as consultants, we present projects on behalf of cities to cities throughout the Bay Area. As in our, evening jobs, we volunteer. And so it is interesting for meetings where you can tell if a meeting is run smoothly, and you can tell when a meeting is not run smoothly, right? Because we've been to so many different cities. And one thing I will say that we notice consistently, just in my personal and professional, is during the portion, so maybe you'll have staff presentation, then you'll have applicant presentation, and then you'll have clarifying questions of the applicant before you open up the item for public comment, right? And so we've seen oftentimes where that period where you're opening it up for questions of the applicant, oftentimes commissioners will start sharing their opinions, which is way too early and inappropriate, right? So to your point, Commissioner, you do want to keep a neutral kind of interaction with the public so the public feels heard and that they aren't already, that you haven't decided how you're going to vote on a project. So to your point.
Yeah, and I too, in my night job, are trying to be incredibly informative of my constituency and my community. And really what I've found is there's really two types of messages that you send out there. It's, hey, we're having this conversation, please participate, right? Which you can absolutely do. It's very hard to get a Brown Act violation for trying to get the word out to say, hey, come give us your opinion. And then there's the summary conversation of, hey, we had this conversation. This was the outcome. If you're interested in these things, please continue to participate. And I think it's that latter where if you put it out there, it's really hard to maybe clarify things or things get misinterpreted. But I still think it's a valiant effort, so I'd say still go for it. Your city attorney would probably say stay off social media. But moving on. So making an effective planning commissioner, not only your expertise, but your community's understanding. So just by our commissioners here, how many years have each of you kind of lived in the community? Just 5 years, 10 years?
20.
20? Okay. So your perspective is going to be very different than maybe somebody who just moved to the community last year, right? And maybe doesn't understand the contentious battle about the project that happened 10 years ago and how we got here. So just remember that the perspective of everybody participating is not a level playing field. And it's okay to bring up that opinion if it has relevance in the conversation in which you're having. Because your knowledge base and the fact that you've been here for 20 years is incredibly important to everybody who hasn't. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, yes, and I do agree with that, but I also never discredit someone that's only been here for a year, right? Because they're, maybe it's a member of the public who's participating, they have a different perspective than someone who has been here 20 years. Where I live, I've been there 35 years, so went to school there, raised my kids there. It's a very different perspective than someone who's moved in just say 4 years ago and has a kindergartner. But it doesn't mean that it's a more valuable perspective.
That's right. That's right. I think, and having that open mind and listening to all those facets of opinion is what makes this democratic process work. But I think part of that is making sure that you understand and are prepared for the conversation. So it is, I would say, easy for Anna and myself is we do this as our day job. And so our night job is pretty easy when we were preparing and reading a 400-page packet and understanding what we need to read and review. And it can be incredibly overwhelming. But making sure you're making the commitment to read it and understand and reach out to staff. You have the great fortune of having amazing staff that's willing to sit down and review things with you. Like they have time to be able to do certain things like that. In some municipalities, sometimes it's just contract staff. So they won't allow planning commissioners or city council to reach out except for maybe for a discrete period of time and it's scheduled. So take advantage of the resources that you have internally because they're very valuable to your community. So staff's role. So think of staff as the facilitator, right? If the chairperson is the quarterback, right? The staff person's calling the plays. They're putting in front of you to make sure that you're trying to be as successful as possible. And that means not only being prepared, but understanding the cadence of how that particular staff meeting is going to go and whether there's anything that is out of order or needs to be considered. And oftentimes to do that, they're going to tell you whether there's any relevant policies or laws or whether there's interpretations of that or things that are currently pending that would have influence over that decision. But really, it is the technical policy perspective in which they bring to the table to present to you to say, hey, here are 3 options for our outside dining ordinance or whatever the particular policy consideration may be. Which one would you prefer? Here are the pros and cons. And it is encouraged to ask for both sides of all those stories so that you can have that good decision. Moving along, one of them is to familiarize yourself with the project, right? A lot of these projects, depending upon the complexity of the entitlement application, especially in current planning, can be very complex, right? Not only didn't really get into this. Can you make sure that you cover that in your presentation? Because I've gotten 4 questions on angled parking and what are the potential impacts of somebody backing up into bicycles or whatever the topic may be, right?
Well, and also for current planning, just like Trevor said, they're very complex developments, requirements. Are they meeting standards? Is it affordable housing? Is there density bonus, right? There's a lot that goes into it. And we all have done it where maybe you don't review ahead of time. And it's obvious, right? It's obvious to the public. It's obvious to your planning commissioners. And then it also does a disservice to staff, right? So the more you can prepare ahead of time, the more you can actually read the staff report, which has every piece of information in theory that you would need, that the public would need. Just a good idea and a good reminder to reach out ahead of time, go visit the site, walk around the site, look at it on Google Earth, understand the project that is actually in front of you, that you are making a decision on behalf of the community.
I have a question. For all these activities, and we do them, I know my fellow commissioners do, and I do, because we all come prepared. I was just wondering, what do you consider a reasonable amount of lead time to be able to accomplish that for some of these more complex
Yeah,
projects?
so first let me clarify. I wasn't implying that as commissioners, you actively don't come prepared. I just want to clear that up. So typically packets come out multiple days in advance, right? So if your meetings are on Tuesday, I'm guessing they come out by Thursday or Wednesday the week prior. And so personally, I read through it as soon as it comes out so that I know. So ours come out on typically Thursdays, or in theory Wednesday, Thursday, because we have Monday meetings. I read it right away because I know staff is only available on Friday. If I wait to read it for the very first time Sunday night before my Monday meeting, it then does staff a disservice. If I'm reaching out to them at 2:00 on a Monday and our meeting's at 7:00, it doesn't give them as much time. So my personal plan or, approach is to do it the night it comes out or the morning after it comes out. Get your preliminary list of questions, think through it for a couple days, and then follow up with any others,
Most of us don't have that option. We have full-time jobs.
as do I. Yeah.
Oh, but you're
Plus
you're
single
still
mom,
reading
yeah.
something on Friday morning when you have a full-time job. I can't do that at my job.
It's hard, right?
I'm not allowed. I have to work when I'm at work.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is the time allocation is one of the incredible challenges of government in and of itself, to plan the right amount of time. So one of the tools that we work with our cities on is, for example, say you have a development application in which you might get notice that there's a notice of preparation for an environmental impact report, right? You could tell your staff, tell Eric, hey, this is really interesting to me. Please include me on all the notices related to this project, so you're not trying to review the draft DIR when it's coming to you for consideration as part of the overall project application. You could be tracking and following that process as the community is, because it is a very cumbersome process, especially if you're having to make the decision with everything in front of you and you're like, oh, wow, I got 5,000 pages to read, right?
Yes, TEQA's a whole nother layer.
And just to jump in here real quick, I think we talk about this when planning commissioners come on board with just initial orientation. We are, and to Trevor and Anna's point, we make ourselves available for the commission at all times, recognizing that you might not be able to get through the packet until the weekend or that Monday ahead of the meeting. But even the day of the meeting, I think I've had conversations or email exchanges with all of you at certain points. So please continue that. I certainly try to keep my calendar as clean as possible on Tuesdays so that if stuff comes up at the last minute, I can make myself available. So happy to help.
And I think it's really important to understand that your value and your knowledge is understanding the policy decision that is put forth in front of you. You don't need to be the traffic engineer, right? Like, you don't need to necessarily understand the nitty-gritty related to the vehicle miles traveled methodology that the city has to follow related to greenhouse gas reduction. That is not necessarily your role here. But it's absolutely understandable for you to walk to Eric and go, hey, I need to understand why it is we're looking at this, because I've gotten 3, 4, 500 emails about this topic, and I want to make sure that my head's wrapped around it, so when we have this conversation, I'm prepared. And oftentimes, just that topical notice, Eric can give you, or staff can give you, the right amount of information so that you feel informed and can make that decision. Into that, this is a good one. Staff is a resource and your friend, right? The idea of going to Eric or any staff, your staff member or planning staff, and saying, look, I've got a punch list on this project. These are the 3 hot button issues that have been raised to me, or people have been sending me emails out, or I have concerns with myself. Can we talk through these? So that they can point out ahead of time, oh yeah, Pedestrian conflicts, that's covered in the traffic study. That's a subsection of the EIR. It's question number C. So if you want to just know about that, I can give you the page that you can find it on, right? They can help guide the amount of effort it will take to actually review this information.
And it's also fine to fully understand the staff report and not ask any questions too.
So when it gets to a project review, here are just some of the common questions that we like to try to provide so people can ask themselves. So what should the community look like? Because you have a design review capacity, are there any community needs that are not necessarily being met by this? So for example, you have the benefit of maybe being involved in planning conversations, which could apply to a project, but might not be reflected in one. So say you do a design standard workshop for a particular boulevard and you spend so much time on a pedestrian crossing and they're like, oh, well, instead of the in the road lit markers, we're gonna go with the flashing beacon signs. But there's another project in which you want to try to implement that on to say, look, this would actually really help the community feel more inherently consistent if we were to able to implement something like that in this project. Like that is feedback and knowledge that you can bring to that table. Does the proposed use enhance the community today and beyond? Because the interesting thing about planning is that if you look back in decades, there's always a use of the decade, right? In the 80s, and in the 90s, everybody wanted an auto mall, right? And in the 2000s, everybody wanted a tech campus in their community. Now you can see how or a big box store, right? You can go back in decades and see the use and the time that every community wanted and how they've had to evolve over time. So what I would say is make sure that you're keeping the perspective of not only today in this project application, but is this a trend of a use or is it gonna really last in perpetuity because those decisions live on?
I have a question / comment.
Yeah.
I guess. I don't know if it's a question, but so where I struggle sometimes, and I think you've heard me say this multiple times, is that, we're told that you have to evaluate the project on the basis of the project merits, right?
Merits of the project, yeah.
Which I know is technically true, but my response to that is I don't live in a vacuum, right? And so, and I think there's also kind of a spectrum of planning. Planning is gray. Eric and I have had this conversation. It's not black and white, as I think certainly the state wants it to be.
Except for objective design standards. No, keep going, yeah.
Yeah.
That was the joke.
Different opinions.
Yeah.
But I think where what I'm hearing here is more of how I think about this, right? Which is different from the project's merits, because we've had multiple instances where something has been extended, not built, comes back for a time extension, and now the area around it has changed. So now, therefore, that project no longer fits, right? Or I'll create an, because I don't want to bring up something that may come back, but let me create a silly example, right?
Okay.
So in an industrial zone, right, next to a housing community and a school, since it's an industrial zone, an applicant's put forward a nuclear power plant, right? Obviously, the nuclear power plant may be able to go in the industrial zone, right? But the cumulative impact of the area around it doesn't fit. So how I think about that, approach thinking about that is, what is the impact of the project on the community around where that project's going to go, not just the merits of the project. What I just heard you say is more in line with how I think about it, not that I'm right or wrong, right? It's just how I approach the thought process for an item versus just being a box checker and saying the merits of the projects on their own, because it has to be a balance, does it not?
Yeah, it's always going to depend based on what consideration or decision you're making is how I'd started out,
You're on the city council.
That's right, yeah.
Benicia.
Yeah.
Perfect.
But your sentiment is right. What you're trying to do is take in factors for consideration to make an informed decision. And that informed decision can both be on the merit of the project itself, but it can also be in the circumstances, the adjacency, the consistency, the policy conformancy. And we were actually just having this conversation earlier in that we just told you that your general plan is your guideline and it is your Bible. And I just pointed out to you that yours is almost 10 years old.
Exactly.
And as part of that, your community will continue to evolve and have to evaluate how maybe you would have approved a single family residential project directly adjacent to a gas station 3 decades ago or something like that, but you're reconsidering that now because you already got 5 of them, right? And so the evolution of how you apply that policy is the lens in which you apply as planning commissioners, and that's the value in which you bring. When you say the merits of the project, the real distinction there is you really want to make sure that you're not calling out things that aren't factual related to the application, because that's where the circumstances and the legal battles kind of come from, right? Like, oh, I don't like this particular developer, insert X, because they did a project here and my neighbor's windows fell out, right? Or whatever it is. And that's where it gets rough.
Well, yeah, so I was just gonna say, why don't you just take mine for the next one?
So
Because this falls right into it.
yeah, so the idea of due process is the fact that you have to be reasonable and non-discriminatory, right? Because maybe there was a national headline of some sort of discrimination action that's taking place, and then you have to make a decision locally. That is relevant information, but you can't necessarily go the other way because of it, right? You can't just act with bias in your decision making. And some of those decisions or actions are incredibly important because they're either legislative or quasi-jurisdictional, judicial, pardon me. And so legislative ones are, hey, you have to have a general plan. The legislature says you got to do this, right? You've got to make certain decisions. Now, the quasi-judicial ones are, well, you could say yes or no to the development application. You don't need to do that. The state is not requiring you to do that. And without some housing laws that are being imposed on every community. But I think the part of that you always need to keep in the back of your mind is the forum is for the community that's watching and listening and trying to understand, so that the public information can be exchanged, so that nothing's happening, behind closed doors, right?
Right, so that's why meetings are recorded. That's why there's procedures for conduct, for engagement of the public. Public staff reports are available. Noticing is available ahead of time. Did that help, or do you have more?
Eric, probably not gonna like my next statement, but it just validated my thought process in terms of that it definitely is a cumulative, every project has an impact beyond itself, right? And that, based on what I'm hearing, it just validates my process of how I think about it, which is you have to take in the totality of the impact of the project on not only the project itself, but the surrounding projects. So I think I made a comment in one of the past meetings where I said, I think we do a good job planning for the project itself. I don't think we always do a good job planning for the residents that are already here.
And part of that, right, is staff's responsibility to help direct you of what the case law says in certain instances. Like if you, so let's just talk about CEQA. We'll get there in a second. But whether the project has an impact on the environment or not is what should be considered, not the impacts of the environment on the project. For example, say you have a Buddhist monastery that gets built in town, and it's a very quiet activity, but right next door there's a high school football stadium, right? And it plays loud football games every Friday night with lights. Well, the impacts of that football stadium on that project, we're told by case law in our environmental review documents, we're actually not allowed to look at, right? So staff sometimes could be giving you guidance to make sure that you understand, or you don't inadvertently say things in meetings that might cause challenges later.
Yeah, I can share an example, a personal experience, a parcel, maybe that neighbors, or just say a single family residential parcel, neighbors are used to it. It's never been developed. They like to use it for extra parking, whatever it might be in their neighborhood. But someone does own that parcel, and that parcel is zoned for residential and for single family. So that property owner does have a right to develop it as single family, meeting all of the zoning requirements. And in this case, the community was very upset because it had always been undeveloped. It was their extra little kind of personal space. But in that case, the property owner has a legal right to develop within the zoning requirements on their own property. Much simpler example than than the one you're thinking of, I'm sure.
But your point gets to kind of the next slide, which is when we have to come to a finding related to a particular project, we often talk about the concept as planning professionals of, like, I use the term decision trees. If I have to make a decision, what is my supporting evidence to get to the point of needing to make a decision? And oftentimes that is what you want to say into the microphone, because it is showing the community, I don't want to approve this project because I really believe in our tree preservation ordinance. This particular project is going to be impacting 25 heritage trees, which is incredibly important from my perspective to the general plan and our community's heritage, right? Like, not just, I don't like this project because it's cutting down trees, right? There's a difference in how you support that statement so that it's very clear. So in the event that it's challenged, our council will be able to go back and say, look, no, they were very decisive on supporting with factual information as to why they made this decision. Not just because they didn't go to the Arbor Day in town or something like that, right? Yeah.
I think that's a really good time to just remind the commission of one of our recent projects where we had a variance was that issue. And there was a lot of public comment in opposition to the grant of the variance. And, but we had to kind of remind the commission that our job is to look at those variance findings specifically and ensure that you could make those variance findings or could not make those variance findings, right? Because the public is not focused on whether you can make the findings or not. They're focused on whether this house is going to be too close to my fence, right? And those variance findings might allow you to consider that as evidence in support of whether you could make a finding or not. So I thought that was a good example there.
I didn't even know about that, but yeah, thanks.
Yeah, just one last comment, and just on the meetings. I think what this, over the 4 years that I've been on, I think what this commission has done, I think a good job of, when a commissioner is not sure, needs more information, or how do I want to put this? I'll just use myself as an example. I've said this before. No one's gotten me to a yes or to a no yet, right? I think what this commission has done pretty consistently is talk through the project to try to get somebody to a yes or no, and at some point, okay, we're ready to move forward. I think this group I think we just need to be mindful of that we continue to do that, because I think that's beneficial not for not only the applicant, but also the public, but also to make sure that we're approaching it the right way, because we all bring a different perspective to the conversation. We may not agree on each other's perspective, but quite often it's helpful to hear why someone, I mean, you don't know which way someone's going to vote, but what they're saying, you can kind of glean from it, and then you can dig in why. And I think what I see in other commission meetings that I watch, because I'll watch a couple cities when there's projects up for work, and some city council meetings outside of this one as well as this one, there's much less discussion. It's more, this is what I think and that's it. And I think that's what's made this commission particularly effective in terms of difficult decisions, I guess is the best way of putting it.
He's absolutely right. And so what we do is we'll spend an inordinate amount of time going back and
Through the
forth,
chair, can you please
educating
speak
one
into your mic?
another.
Thank you.
Educating one another, and asking questions amongst ourselves, which is interesting because typically the clarifying questions typically go to the applicant, but we find ourselves doing that amongst ourselves to try to make sure that we've got as much information as needed before we actually make that motion. And it doesn't have to, we don't have to agree, but we do want to exhaust as much as possible so that when we do make the motion, no one can walk away and say,
And-
if I had only.
Yeah, and so I use the phrase topic tracking.
Yeah.
So staff is going to present to you maybe 5 things that you need to consider and take formal action on. But of those 5, there might be 5 more for each one in which there might be a comment. And so good chairs and commission members do topic tracking. Okay, so I heard somebody stand up here and say something about X. Okay, so we're having a discussion. We haven't covered X. What does everybody think about X? Right, like that topic tracking, and I would try to inform all of our planning commissions and city councils, do topic tracking. All right, so parking. Okay, parking's here. We've had 4 people talk about parking. Hey, Eric, can you clarify what's going on with parking? Because clearly we have a lot of people that are interested about parking, and I want to make sure that we all get what's going on, right? topic tracking is an important tool that is very useful because next thing you do is you go, okay, seems like we've got 5 of the 6 topics covered and we have answers for what's going on. What's the one last topic that we don't have an answer to? Staff. How can we handle this, right? And that topic tracking approach will really help you expedite your conversation in decisions, because if you can go, okay, first, we're gonna tackle the parking thing. That's the first topic as the chair, right? If you want to facilitate the conversation on the topics or the items rather than, so what does everybody think? Right? If you break it down to a topical consideration, it really helps not only better inform the community that's watching and that you're hearing them, but also organize your conversation of thought to get to a decision.
Real quick, I just want to jump in before we go to the next slide, because there was some talk about findings, and it does relate a little bit to the last meeting where the commission talked about the conditional use permit process, right? How that's structured and certain conditions, how they're monitored. Yeah, as you know, that when the agenda packets go out on Thursdays, there's a ton of information for each agenda item. Some of it's materials that are submitted by the applicant that are important to be able to review the project, but there's obviously a staff report for each item and then either a resolution or multiple resolutions. And I just wanted to remind the commission that with the resolutions themselves, because that's what the commission ends up, voting on and adopting, we do our best at staff level to draft those and create those for the commission, both in terms of findings and conditions of approval. But it's super important that the commission take extra time reviewing those and being comfortable with how those are structured and how those are worded. Because once the motion is made to adopt a resolution, that's it, essentially. So again, we do our best to make sure that they're in a good spot for the commission, assuming a certain recommendation. There have, of course, been times where items have been continued and then we go back and kind of rework them, or the commission makes a decision that's different than what staff had recommended, and that's totally fine as well. We come back with a reworked resolution. But again, I just wanted to stress the importance of those because that's what you end up adopting at the end of the night. Thank you.
And one last thing on findings, it's on the previous slide. It's the bullet on the right, relevant to the issue before the commission. So in Lafayette, we have phase 1 developments, phase 2 developments. Phase 1 is siting and massing. So as a planning commissioner, if we're seeing a phase 1 development, I'm only looking at the siting and the massing. What often happens is the applicant in their package will have some preliminary design, maybe some elevations included, and oftentimes the planning commission will start going off track and commenting on the design or the articulation, which has nothing to do with the item in front of us, which is being able to make the findings for the siting and massing. So just keeping that in mind of what is your role? What are you making a decision on at that meeting for a given project? And if a different component of the project comes back later on, great. But tonight, what are you making your decision on and your findings for?
So I just have one final comment. The staff report that we receive most often is written in support of the staff recommendation. So the information that they give us, and this is understandable, is tuned to that recommendation. So they say, well, this project is consistent with the general plan for this bullet point, this bullet point, this bullet point, but the general plan is extensive. So how do you, when you have a project that you know is controversial and you know you're going to get questions, to me it would be helpful if staff would anticipate public questions and get some of that supplemental material into the staff report. Otherwise, I don't know about you, but I find myself spending a lot of time doing my own research into municipal code and the general plan and the various documents, design review, because I want to know more about why I might not support staff decision, and staff doesn't really take that on as a role to say that here are some reasons why you might want to take a hard look at this. It's the staff report is driven by the staff recommendation in almost every case.
Yeah, and that is very common, right? It's the decision tree to support how we are making that recommendation. And so, but your point is very well taken. You might, and I'm an analytic type person in general, so I always think of things in numbers. Say you got 10 policies and staff says, oh no, it's inherently consistent and it checks 7 of the boxes, right? Well, somebody could say, well, that's not consistent enough for me. That's not 80%, right? Like, and so because it's not 90, right? And so because of that, I don't think we should approve it. But the reality there is that is the policy decision which is presented to you. And your ability to say, well, look, if the 2 policies that it's inconsistent with are what makes Brentwood amazing, that is why you are here to try to help inform, garner support, change, inform opinions to try to move any decision one way or the other. And I would say that that's the democratic process, but it's not uncommon, right? It's not an unbiased evaluation that maybe goes in a voter pamphlet, right? Written by like city attorneys about ballot measures or anything like that. It is written in a way to support the decision tree which is being put in front of you. So we've covered this. I think the idea is, obviously you guys have already done a lot of your homework on a bunch of projects and decisions, but the only thing I'd reiterate that I haven't said here is listening is an incredibly hard skill, especially when it comes to the forum in which you are sitting here under the spotlight and providing enough time and helping facilitate and reiterate. So I always like the feedback loop of either the chair or the vice chair. Okay, so I'm hearing that you have concern about this topic. I'm hearing that you have concern about this topic, so that there's active listening taking place to understand how you want to facilitate the conversation. Again, all these meetings are an opportunity for the community that has shown an interest to come get information, be educated, learn about a topic so that they can either further engage. And sometimes it's the last meeting, but oftentimes it's really not the last meeting, right? And I think staff, I do this all the time when we might have a policy consideration or a planning application to say, okay, staff, we didn't cover the schedule, the overview of the schedule in enough detail for me, but it looks like, so we're talking about this tonight. We're planning on hearing this in another 3 months. So hey, community, if you're out there, come to this meeting in April or whatever it is, because this is going to be back on the agenda, right? So that they know the cadence of when to engage, because a lot of our conversations are very procedural and structured of when we need to do things. But unless you know, you can feel very lost. And it's part of our responsibility to help inform the public as to how to engage and what they can participate in and what they cannot. And again, the purpose and the action of the meeting, staying on topic, what your purview is related to certain things. And actually, I think it's actually a lot harder on the Planning Commission than it is, say, on the City Council, because of just simply the structure of things. Your purview is a lot more limited, whereas City Council meetings can kind of veer off and talk about a lot of things because they have a broader jurisdictional authority, right? Where yours is land use and zoning. And although there might be a business implication or a fiscal implication that you want to bring up as, sprinkling of dressing around the side of the conversation, but it's really hard for that to be influencing your decision-making. Yeah.
If I can just,
Please.
I think this is more, I think we up here understand kind of how projects end up on our docket, right? But I think there is reading social media and all that kind of, what the Brentwood residents criticize the Planning Commission, City Council, and staff for is stop bringing fast food, gas stations, and storage facilities and housing, but that's a whole other issue. Let's stick to the first 3 I said. And our control and even the staff's control, if there is an open lot and it's zoned for X, someone can bring a permit before us, and we have to, at some point, staff has to make a decision to bring it to us to present. It's not optional for us to not listen to it. And if it fits land use, and the zoning regulations, we have to give it either a yes or a no vote. But we don't, I think there's a perception out there that,
That you're making it up as you go.
well, and that's all we want.
Yeah.
But it's zoned for certain things. And so therefore, that's why projects end up coming forward. So I don't know if you can expand on that, or, because in you guys obviously are in government in 2 other cities in East County,
Yep.
right? So,
I would say that the way that I kind of try to present that challenge for the community to understand is you start at the pyramid. We have a general plan document that says that this use is identified to be in this area. Staff has received an application for that use. Staff has determined that based on all the information they presented, it's consistent. That's why it's before you for consideration, right? So that they understand it's not just like, oh, well, I called up Joe who owns Bob's Burgers and he's gonna, the community has a perception oftentimes that it's like you're facilitating these projects, right? Instead of you're making a determination based on our policy documents, whether it should or it shouldn't be.
And so there's policy documents, and then where I live, we have a BART station. So, and our entire downtown is within a half mile of BART. So that opens up a whole nother set of state law and housing projects that are allowed by right because of state law. And so oftentimes, we're lucky to have a member of the public here tonight, but oftentimes there aren't as many people engaged from the community until they start seeing the development. And that's where some of the frustration comes from the community. So no matter if it's the drive-through restaurant or a 4-story residential, high density, there's always the policy, like Trevor's saying, there's the state law, a lot plays into it. And sometimes as commissioners, you feel your hands are tied. I do sometimes, but hard position to be in sometimes.
And,
So
and
I think we're gonna, oh, yeah.
sorry, just one other thing to add on to this, because I think there is a little bit of a misconception at times. And so I appreciate Vice Chair Sparling's comments and Trevor and Anna's as well. But I just want to make sure everybody knows staff spends absolutely zero time drumming up applications. We have a ton of other things that we work on. And what that largely results from is people submitting applications to us that we are then obligated to process. And they may not be the type of application that, people in that particular neighborhood of the city or the commissioner or the council want, but that's an application that was submitted and we process. But again, we do not solicit any kind of applications to get submitted to us.
and that's why I wanted to bring it up, because there's been a lot of chatter for 8 years, at least, when I started really coming, I've seen it for a long time, right? And there's that perception out there, and I understand why, because that's what they see. But I mean, that's what the economic development team here is trying to do, is trying to find businesses for those areas. There is a group in Brentwood that does that, right? So I think that's where if people have questions about what are we working on and what they can share, that's where they should go to get their questions answered. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that it's an economic development project and there may be, meetings or conversations happening on one side or the other, yeah, that certainly happens. But I'm talking about at the planning staff level, we react to and process applications that get submitted to us, whether it's a use permit for a drive-through restaurant, whether it's a subdivision for a new single-family neighborhood, whether it's a larger shopping center, whether it's a variance for a home that's proposing an addition, whatever it is, those come to us through somebody, right? Whether it's a property owner or a developer, but we do not initiate any of those.
And I'm just going to be mindful of time because we're going to take a break here in the next couple slides, just to give everyone surprisingly, it goes by fast, right? But on the idea of lecturing the public, right? The idea is I've always relied on process. Good government shows and discloses process. It's not just hey, this got slid in front of the planning commission at the last minute and now we got to make a decision. Citing a process in which staff had a 60-day review period with the applicant. They submitted supplemental information. We gave them feedback, and it was a back and forth, and the project was revised, and it's been however long, so that people understand that this isn't just happening tonight and somebody's making it happen type of thing is very important. And salient topic, keeping tempo with your meetings and understanding timing so that you actually give all your items the due time in which they're programmed for. All cities are super guilty of this. I actually think city councils are probably the worst. You might have a heavy agenda and you go, okay, the first 2-3 items might take up 3/4 of the time. And then 10 o'clock comes around and people are just like, oh my gosh, it's getting late, right? And you want to get through things. So as the chair or the vice chair, we try to facilitate our vice chairs to be the clock keeper, right? Like, okay, if it, or if you want to simply just have that role in agreement, like, okay, I think this is going to be about a 20-30 minute presentation and about 30 minutes for Q&A, because you won't realize, especially if you're engaging, how quick time will fly by. But then you realize, oh my gosh, we spent 4 hours on the first item and we only have, an hour left before it's midnight to do the remaining 3. So just have somebody that's keeping a watch for that is what I'd say. And then making sure that your final action is clear, right? Wanting to make sure that the public understands, look, this is the approval, or this is the tentative review, or this is a study session, or this project needs to be recommended to the city council. Understanding and making sure that, and city attorneys are always the best at this, please read the resolution into the record or whatever they say. But that is incredibly important as well. And you want to cover the last one?
Yeah, the last one, obviously it's nothing that you share at the end of a meeting, right? Or even at the beginning of the meeting, but it's things to keep in mind for yourself, clarifying and revisiting your purpose as a commissioner. You have a certain term, you get reappointed, you maybe reapply, but just a good self-check-in, right? Why am I here? Why am I doing this? What perspective am I bringing? What does the community need from me? And how can I help change the community as a result of me being on the planning commission?
Yeah, because whether you like it or not, right, this is a leadership forum. You're trying to help guide and lead the community. Whether all your citizens are here or not, that is the responsibility that you have serving in this seat, is to be a community leader and represent the diverse perspectives of your particular community and make sure that they're all heard in this forum so that no one feels like they are left out. So I think with that, Eric, maybe we're going to take some question and answers, and then after Q&A for a little bit, we can take a break, but maybe we go to online, or how do you want to facilitate it?
Yeah, I would say at this point, unless the commission feels differently, we can just continue on with the presentation, but certainly encouraging questions as they come from the commission, and then we'll open it up to the public at the end. Yeah.
Perfect. Just wanted to provide the opportunity. All right. So pivoting, does anyone need?
I think at some point we just talked about tempo and time, and we're going to put public comments at the end, right? I think this would be, I know we're not through the whole thing, we're going to get into CEQA. I personally would like to see it broken in two and have public comment or questions. Maybe there's none and we move on. That would be what I would look for, but I'll obviously.
Totally fine. It's up to the commission.
Pardon?
Totally fine. Up to the commission.
Yeah.
Everyone handle
I
it.
think that's appropriate.
Yeah, I concur.
So with that said, we'll go ahead and move into public comments.
Through the chair, we have no one in the Zoom audience, but we do have one person here live, Mr. Danny Dorman.
Thank you, Dave. I really do appreciate it. And stop me if you heard this before. With all due respect, I spent the last hour and change listening to statements that we already know. Once upon a time, I was a project manager, and when I trained others on project management, I often imparted this mantra, for lack of a better term. Every plan has flaws. You just don't know what they are or where they'll pop up. I say that because we have a general plan that is continually changed. We have CEQA, which you'll talk about in a moment, that always seems to be passed over. We have conflicting standards and statutes. With respect to not getting into the weeds, it's generally the weeds that aren't noticed until it's too late. I dare say that the Planning Commission, that's our roundup. You guys are our kill it all, weed and feed. So like the issue I brought up earlier regarding the 4 feet and the inability for handicapped and parents with strollers to move around, when is the public actually able to voice their concerns? What options do we have when the city desires to build a walkway to nowhere that has very little foot traffic? And I'm talking about that beautiful little overpass that I've never seen anyone on yet. I don't know how much money we spent, but boy. So anyway, and of course, there's the it ain't us, it's the state. So how about a training course on how to work within the constraints of statutes that benefit me and my neighbors the way Lafayette, Black Hawk, and Walnut Creek seem to have? Listening to the duties that should be handled by the Planning Commission are often hijacked by the City Council. And I have a great respect for the majority of City Council. The beauty of being on this side of the dais is I can say things without sugarcoating it. Staff brings recommendations that are skewed to the applicant. More often than not, it's the diligence of members of the Planning Commission and council members and regular folks like me who have absolutely nothing to do but sit here that brings items to the attention that should have been found by staff. All right? I don't get paid to do it. I spend what little time I have doing something I really shouldn't have to do, but I have no choice. And some of you and some of the council don't have a choice because the recommendation, you would think the recommendation would be skewed more towards the balance between public and private interest. And let me tell you, this is why I'm not running for anything, because you guys are hamstrung. And I feel sorry for you. And this is why boneheads like me speak up. I'm personally exhausted coming in and being more prepared than the folks who get paid to do so. So how about discussing alternatives to helping this body work for the benefit of our city, and not so much going over and explaining their roles and responsibilities. I think we already had that Kumbaya meeting last year. So I would love to hear that, and I'll listen intently on my way home. Thank you very much.
At this time, there are no hands raised in Zoom and no other speakers in person.
Okay, thank you, Ms. April. At this time, I will now close public comment. Any discussion or questions from the commission?
I just have a question. So when someone brings a project to, the planning department, okay, and so often I hear that they've been working with planning staff to resolve all of the, complaints that you guys might have raised during when they brought it there. So my understanding would be that the applicant brings a project, you guys work to minimize the objections as you know them. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yes.
Good.
The short answer is, and I'm just trying to think of an application that was submitted. Staff always has comments. I can't remember an application that was number one submitted and we had all the information that was needed. There's always something that's missing. And there's always a comment that we have, whether it's a land use comment or a comment related to infrastructure or, a city service that is provided. So in most cases, there's a tremendous amount of back and forth that happens between staff and the applicant in order to get an application to the commission. There have been occasions where, the applicant wasn't really interested in listening to what staff had to say, and they basically said, just put us on an agenda. And staff had recommended, denial of that particular application. The commission said they were going to deny it, and then the applicant decided, oh, boy, I guess we should go back and redo it. So they take all kinds of different forms, and I know I'm probably, when I said yes, that was the actual answer, but I wanted to explain the why behind that.
Thank you.
Commissioner Spaulding?
Yeah, I think, staff gets a lot of heat from the public, and I don't think that, I think they're following the land use as it is with the general plan. And I think, when I mentioned earlier, planning is a gray, an area of gray, and that's our role, right? To figure out whether the project should move forward in its current format. There's been many times where the commission has asked for changes, and I think we've done a good job in being disciplined in not designing from the dais quite often when we could have, and it's been referred back to staff to work with the applicant on the changes, or referred to the design subcommittee for review in order to speed it up. So I think that if we continue what we're doing, I think we'll be okay as long as we do our job. I think if we stop asking the questions and stop challenging staff, I think that's where we become box checkers, which I don't think that's our role in this process at all. And I think that's been a question for past commissioners for sure, is are we box checkers or can we actually think outside the box, right? And I think there's different philosophies to that. And I think the current commission is not box checkers.
No, not at all.
I also wanted to say, because this came up a little bit earlier, and maybe to address Mr. Dorman's comment as well. I've heard the terms like rubber stamp quite a bit from different people. That's never staff's intent or perspective. We're constantly looking holistically at projects. We do try to anticipate concerns, whether they're from the community or commissioners, things that have come up on other projects. Do we hit those all the time? No, it's just not possible. We can't anticipate certain comments that are made at an actual meeting. We don't know what people are going to say, what they're going to come up with. But we are professionals and we do our best to present the totality of a project to the commission. And we're constantly working on improving that as well. Every project is super unique and super different, right? So even projects on the same agenda, a similar project on another agenda 3 months later, they're all different. But we spend, I just want to say, we spend a lot of time at the staff level working together, both as a planning unit and then planning along with the different disciplines within the city to make sure that when an application does get put on an agenda, that everything's been addressed. Now, that doesn't mean there's not going to be questions, right, from the commission or the public. We expect that. But again, we do our best to address those ahead of time as much as possible.
Commissioner Rod?
Yeah, I've been sitting here thinking about this, and I'm probably more inclined to make a speech than ask a question, so I'm just going to pass. Thank you.
Okay. I don't have any at this time either.
So I guess with that, we'll continue on to maybe the second part of the presentation. And as you have questions that come up, we're going to try to move these a little bit along a little bit quicker. So if I find myself going too fast, just give me a head nod, or I'll try to look for your lights and we'll kind of pause there.
Also, maybe just before you get started, Trevor, just in terms of hands, or how familiar is everyone with CEQA?
Yeah.
Yeah?
We've all
Okay,
read
perfect.
multiple EIRs. Good. So we'll just start at the beginning. Obviously, it's a very complex process, but why do we have CEQA? It was basically an initiation after President Nixon was in office and actually enacted NEPA. NEPA is a federal statute for the disclosure of how federal funds were utilized and the potential impacts, because previously it was just economic-based decision-making, and this brought in an environmental lens to ensure that there was community environmental considerations as federal government decisions. Following that, California, being the leader that we are, enacted what is considered to be a mini NEPA, or in our case, we call it CEQA. There is many other mini NEPAs throughout the United States, but we were the first. But it has evolved, and it actually, in 1970, it very much mimicked the federal level statute in which it was only about public projects. So if the city wanted to build a pipeline or something like that, but there was a landmark case, which is the Friends of Mammoth case, which widened its applicability to all discretionary actions. And that's why you oftentimes have land use decision-making authority for CEQA documents. So what are the purposes of CEQA? You have to remember there's 4 primary purposes: to inform, identify, prevent, and disclose. So the idea is to make sure that you have and are acting with your own independent judgment on the document, and that you feel informed about the decision that you're making, and that the community understands what's taking place. So the state says it's pretty easy. All you have to do is follow the flow chart.
Yeah.
But really what it is there's a different level of environmental review depending upon the particular project or application, and the type of document. That's actually gotten a little bit more complex over the year with some of our state streamlining types of documents. So there's no longer just EIRs and ISMNDs and exemptions. There's things called sustainable communities environmental assessments and specific tiering documents. But that's why you have teams to try to help you identify the path for the appropriate project. So not every single project requires the preparation of a big EIR or a lengthy ISMND. There are specific exemptions in which fall into 2 distinct categories: statutory or categorical. Statutories are basically legislative actions in which the legislature has taken a position on a particular type of project. One we always talk about is the Olympic Games. And you might go, how is that possible? The Olympic Games build stadiums and make massive retail malls and all these things that have impacts that we study every single day. But the difference is that the legislature decided that those particular project actions were exempt for other reasons, right? And those apply to the entire state. That's that whole exemption hierarchy. Categorical exemptions are the ones in which your staff might utilize all the time, and they always have Cs, right? So they're classes. So the C that stands in front of them, it's class 1, class 2. I think there's a total of 35, if I remember correctly, but yeah, the class 32 infill development one is one that's oftentimes utilized for particular types of projects and applications. Just know that each exemption or class has specific performance expectations and how you need to meet them to utilize that exemption. So for example, a class 32 infill has specific studies that you have to prepare to make findings so that you can utilize it.
And exemptions, your projects always have to be consistent with the land use and the zoning, nor can they have mitigation.
Which is actually like the biggest pitfall we oftentimes see. You might have an applicant that submits a study saying, oh, hey, we're going to utilize this exemption, but in their study it says, oh, we have to mitigate something. You can't mitigate yourself to an exemption. By identifying a mitigation, you've identified an impact. By identifying the impact, you've excluded yourself from utilizing an exemption. So this is just a hierarchy of the type of project level CEQA documents. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, question.
Yeah, I have a question based on what you just said.
Yeah.
So if someone had a mitigation or, an applicant found a mitigation, would staff capture that and say, hey, would that get to the planning
Hopefully
commission?
it doesn't get to you, right? That's what I would say is that, and in most instances, right, if it's an exemption staff, and Eric and I have talked about this a lot, they're pretty diligent and also in controlling and reviewing the technical information supporting the environmental review process. That's one of the things they look for, because you might have just inconsistencies. A developer might go hire somebody to do traffic and somebody to do bio and cultural, and they might not know how those reports are going to be utilized through the entitlement process. So they might just identify mitigation knowing that it might be needed, but that might have implications on the rest of the process that they're not aware of. And usually staff will catch those things, yeah. So these are just some kind of a hierarchy of the type of project documents, whether it's an initial study, there's tiered ones, there's streamlined documents, there's neg decks, mitigated neg decks, programmatic EARs, program and project EIRs. The list kind of goes on and on. What you need to know about CEQA documents is that they're only as good as the technical information that's actually in them and the level of decision in which you're trying to make. So you might have a very broad level environmental review, and sometimes this is confusing to the community, but the level of a program EIR is not going to have the same level of specificity as, say, a project level EIR. And even though it's an EIR, sometimes that's hard for people to understand. Go ahead, question.
Yeah, so what if we disagree with the findings in the CEQA document because it's not common sense?
Oh, so like that's actually great. There's actually certain resource categories in which you don't have to be a technical expert to offer influential opinion. Let me give you an example. I've got 3 kids. My wife takes my kids all over sports, and we go to practices all the time. We can just as easily stand on the corner and count the amount of cars going in and out of the baseball field as a traffic engineer could, right? You don't need to be a technical expert to count cars, right? You might need to have some technical expertise to identify the difference between a white-tailed kite and a Swenson's hawk, or a red-tailed hawk and a Swenson's hawk, right? So there is certain categories in which expertise weighs in your opinion, but your opinion is still valid in the conversation anyway. The documents themselves, statutorily, are supposed to be written to an 8th grade reading level, which means that you should be able to understand how you're getting to the impact in the decision. The challenge we have in California is it's a very litigious state. So you have a statute that says, hey, make this information very digestible to the public so they understand what's going on. No offense to our attorney in the room, but our attorneys also have a job to try to help the cities position themselves to limit risk and liability, so then they become very complex. But really, as consultants, that's our job, is to try to help navigate that path, is what I would say.
So what about something like, traffic is a great example, because we've all read traffic reports where it says, okay, I'm just going to create an example, right? There's 200 homes going in here, and the daily amount of trips are going to be 50. Well, how is that logical? That's not ever, this is California, right? People are in and out of their house all day long, right? That's another example that always comes up on developments is sound, right?
Noise, yeah.
And sound is, I would think, more technical than traffic, right? If there's 200 homes, there's going to be at least 200 cars and probably 200 trips a day, right? So getting a report that says 50 is not common sense to me. But something like sound, you start getting the more technical ones, how we may disagree with it, or again, it doesn't feel right. How do you use that in the evaluation process?
So what I would tell you is that each resource category, there's 17 categories which have to be answered underneath the Appendix G checklist. Each of those categories, oftentimes each of the individual questions in the categories has a approved methodological approach. Now, it's really easy for resource agencies. So let's just use like biology, right? So if there is a jurisdictional water that's going to be impacted by the project that would need a permit, there is a method in which you evaluate whether that water is a jurisdictional water, what percentage of it will be impacted, what the mitigation is. That is laid out in regulatory documents. What's not laid out, I'll go to the full other end of the scale, is, let's just say it could be subjective, like aesthetics, right? Is it substantially degrading the viewshed of the community? Well, the analyst might view that it isn't, but they might not know that the rock that was put over at the edge of the town was put there by Farmer John back in, like there is certain contextual things which are subjective and some which are very factual and bright lined. As analysts that do this as practice documents, right? Those things, we rely oftentimes on staff and the conversation that unfolds to come to the ultimate determination.
I have one. So they're experts. I mean, these are folks that come in, this is what they do. They've been certified to do what it is they do. And they're bringing information into the well for us to formulate a decision. But oftentimes, example given, the same 200 homes, somehow or another, there's just only going to be one car per household. And we know that that is not the case in the city of Brentwood. We know that there's typically 2, maybe 3. In addition to that, a lot of the information is coming out of a manual that dates back to 1950. So help me understand
Yep,
how
absolutely.
that, without being, confrontational, how do you expect the commissioners to absorb that and make or formulate a decision in knowing that that information is old or inaccurate?
Absolutely. There's a difference between a disagreement amongst experts, right, and inaccuracies. Disagreement amongst experts is allowed for within our statute. You can have a firm A prepare a report saying, I don't think this is an issue, and another firm say it is an issue, or a community member say it is an issue. That discourse is allowed for in the CEQA process. But the lack of understanding to how you got to a conclusion, as a practitioner, I would say, is something that we can happy to work with staff on to make sure that you guys understand what's in front of you. You know what I mean? But specifically for traffic. So there's something called the ITE Trip Generation Manual, which dictates the level of trips which come out of particular land uses. Those land uses are evaluated by a panel, which is a subset of the National Transportation Research Board. That is updated on a cycle, so that cycle depends upon which uses are identified within your state. Now, applying the use code categories to the project is where the gray area is. So I'll give you an example. We're working on a very large logistics operation in the state of California right now. There's over 15 trip generation codes which would apply to that particular project, right? Some of which have massive amounts of trips and some of which don't. And understanding the difference is why our time's valuable, right? That's where having valuable consultants to help you make informed decisions is important. But that's, somebody should be able to stand up in front of you and tell you that. The hard part about it is, Anna and I are here. And Anna's a great case of purpose. She's one person. But behind Anna on any given project is 25 or 30 people that are working to prepare this one document, right? And so it is very hard unless, as commissioners or community members, you go, hey, Eric, everybody's going to want to know about traffic. Then Eric comes and goes, hey, Anna, bring the traffic engineer to the meeting so that we can make sure that everything's, buttoned up and we have the right person in the room. So it's not just the project manager that gets it at the 30,000 foot level.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, please, yeah.
The experts that come in and make these reports, is it possible to challenge their objectivity as someone who's been following these things for a long time, and somebody who used to sit out there and not up here? I would go and research these experts, and I would go to their websites, and they would have glowing statements about how good they were at getting projects approved, because their primary customer is not the city. Their primary customer is people who are investing in projects. But it seems like they only have to show their credentials. They don't have to demonstrate any kind of objectivity.
So what I would say is that I'll defer to Eric in just a minute. So I'm queuing you up. All lead agencies or municipalities have a different process in which they go through and identify consultants or team members to prepare environmental review documents. Some cities do it themselves, right? Some cities hire consultants in only limited circumstances. Some cities have pre-qualified lists in which they've already determined that these are firms in which they would prefer to work with based on the fact that they have met the qualifications in which they deemed appropriate at that time. So then it restricts anybody from just coming in and doing work. So the method which the city of Brentwood would like to employ, I'll defer to Eric if there is anything you'd like to say, but it varies is what I would tell you. But the facts and the science of the process should not vary. And you should absolutely have a high standard and hold consultants accountable for the findings of their reports.
Yeah, and I would just say here in Brentwood, anytime there is a CEQA document that's prepared, and whether that's a mitigated negative declaration or an EIR, EIRs are fairly rare, but we've processed a few in my time here. those are always contracts or agreements that are done through the city. They're funded by applicants. 'Cause I've also heard this misconception that the city is basically spending money on preparing an AIR for like no good reason. The city does not, unless it's a city project, a private project, those documents are funded by the applicants themselves, but they are led by the city. So the prime consultant and any sub-consultants that do technical work for traffic or biology, those are all funded by the applicant, but led by the city staff. And we spend a lot of time reviewing those documents as well. Now, we're not technical experts in some of these areas either, so we have to rely on those that are involved in preparing the documents. Very time intensive, and there's back and forth on those as well. We don't just accept the reports as they come in.
Yeah, and it's a great point, which gets us to our next slide, which is there's a lot of players involved in kind of the preparation of a CEQA document. And oftentimes the lead agency is the one that drives this bus of a CEQA document, which is, Eric was alluding to, is the city in most cases for your projects. But the city has the responsibility of implementing this self-executing statute to ensure that it is meeting the obligation of the disclosure and adhering to all the case law and all the most current standards for how these documents are supposed to be prepared.
So,
Yeah.
I just have I don't know if a follow-up question, but I'm reading Commissioner Floor's body language to the answer to his question, and he was asking the objectivity, and it got me thinking about it is so yes, you're correct. The applicant pays for the CEQA study. But I don't think that answers his question in terms of, I didn't hear an answer that I can process to think about how the applicant has hired somebody who's made data dance to pass, so that the project will come forward, right? I think where Commissioner Floor was going is they're not, their job is to get the documents put together in a way that will allow the city to move the project forward. And so is that really an objective document? And then as planning commissioners, how do we evaluate that if we go to someone, because as a planning commissioner, we can go to the consultant's website and we can see that comment, right? And then what, right? So, okay, obviously if I'm, consultant X has gotten 1,000 of these documents processed through cities across the United States. We've had 0 failures in terms of getting documents approved. Okay, are they, you see where I'm going with it, right? And it may not even be a problem, right? But that's the view, right, of I think what you stated, right, in terms of what maybe members of the public. So as commissioners, how do we evaluate that on whether or not the data, because again, some don't pass common sense.
Well, what I would chime in real quickly is just that oftentimes the data or the technical study supporting a project might have been prepared by a developer and provided to the city, and the city might have another contractor write the CEQA document, right? But the peer review process is one that takes place kind of all throughout a lot of municipalities. Some use it, some don't. Some don't even let developers prepare technical studies or information. But having that verification to Commissioner, how do you say your last name, sir? Floor, okay. Commissioner Floor's point is very common, but there's also certain types of studies in which only are prepared at certain points in a project, right? So you might have like a preliminary geotechnical evaluation for a project to determine whether the soil would support the type of use and design which you're proposing, but it's not to the level of detail like structural foundations or for a high rise in San Francisco, for example. And those are the type of things in which the city is not, or in most cases, those lead agencies aren't going to have the technical bandwidth or understanding to know whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. So it does kind of require the knowledge-based community, whether it's consultants or, whomever is able to come in and chime in on it.
Yeah, and so it's our job as consultants that when we do receive information from the city, let's just say a developer provided, just say the air and noise studies, we would take those from the city staff. At that point, we're in contract with the city staff, and we don't talk to the developer directly unless the city staff is maybe on a call with us. And so we will do what Trevor said, is peer review using our internal experts, because we have those teams in-house. If it was something that, for whatever reason, we didn't have in-house, we would work with an expert to peer review, to check that information, so that then when we're using it to write our CEQA analysis, it has to make sense. No matter what the answer is, if it's an impact or not an impact, it has to make sense. There has to be science and fact behind it.
And it is a very common thing, and I would say one of our responsibilities as planning and environmental planning practitioners is to read and understand everything. So you might have a traffic study, to your point, which says, oh, there's 10 houses, there's going to be 100 trips, and there's going to be, 25 people or whatever the numbers are. But then you go to the utility section, and the water and utility study says, oh, there's going to be, 400 homes and 600 people, and none of the numbers kind of correlate and make sense throughout the entire project. But that is why your staff will stop and require those studies to be reevaluated in the process. So hopefully when it comes to you, everything is in line, right?
Well, then also one thing we'll talk about, I think later in the slides, is substantial evidence for a project versus fair argument and challenging the CEQA document. So I think that'll be to your point in a few slides.
Yeah, it still doesn't answer my question about when I look on the internet and I see the consulting agency advertising to the investor and developer communities that they are good at getting things passed. So that's where I question the objectivity, and I've heard your answers, so thank you very much. Chair Roberts, we've been here for 2 hours. Could we take a break?
Absolutely. This is a good time to take a break. Why don't we take a 15-minute break? Yeah.
Is that candy? I want chocolate. Breath mint. They don't. Oftentimes that happens.
Okay, well. Okay, we're going to go ahead and resume
All
our
righty.
presentation.
And we're back. We're
Thank
going to
you.
jump into the initial study. Anna, why don't you go ahead and get us kicked off?
Yeah, so welcome back. Initial study, so just a reminder, we're talking about CEQA. The initial study is exactly what it says. It's the first step in the CEQA evaluation process. It's an assessment to determine if the project may produce significant environmental effects. And so every project, no matter the project type, where the project is located, every project has to go through the Appendix G checklist, unless your city is a city that has adopted its own environmental guidelines. In Brentwood, they follow the Appendix G checklist. And again, it's a preliminary document that then informs if the project, if the CEQA next step would be an environmental impact report or an MND, which is a mitigated negative declaration, for example. Next slide. So the checklist for the initial study, you need to explain why. So this is a common thing we've been talking about throughout the evening, is backing up your analysis, backing up your findings, backing up, whatever it is, being able to make a determination, not just check a box and not include your analysis underneath it. So here on this slide, it's showing kind of, if you're following on the screen, it's interactive. But if you're looking at your paper, it's just there. So the difference, the high level difference between an MND, an ND, and an EIR. So ND is negative declaration. So you need to have a less than significant impact or no impact to qualify for a negative declaration. If you have a mitigated negative declaration, an MND, it means you're incorporating mitigation at some point in your analysis in one of your resources, and you're incorporating mitigation to lessen a potential impact to a less than significant level. So that's your ND and your MND. If you have a potentially significant impact, that kicks you automatically to an EIR. So in an MND, the mitigated negative declaration, you cannot have a significant unavoidable impact.
The one thing I'd add is just the idea of an EIR. Anna covered it earlier. There is a different standard of review for each of these documents, and it is important to mention that they are not evaluated the same in the court's eyes. The deference is given to the lead agency when preparing an environmental impact report. The deference is given to the opposition when preparing a negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration. Actually, an exemption and an EIR hold the same standard of review, which is interesting because they're on polar ends of the scale of the types of documents.
Okay, so on this slide, it's a CEQA process flow chart. So first, is the project considered a project under CEQA? If so, yes, you prepare an initial study. Kind of like I said on the last slide, are the impacts significant? If yes, you must prepare an EIR. If no, you, depending on the level of impact, it'd either be a negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration.
Just click through the next one for you.
Yeah, so the M&D process highlights. I
think the
guess
thing
we could talk through this.
Yeah, I think the thing we want to highlight here is just the duration of time differences between a ND, MND versus a EIR, right? So when you do a negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration, there is a 30-day public review process which takes place when you release the document. There is a request you can submit to the state clearinghouse for 20 days if there's no state level authority, but those are really few and far between because even the smallest level of state level regulatory engagement, say like the preparation of a SWIP or a regional water quality control permit, triggers the need to actually have a 30-day review. So we don't see many of those. if you're looking at other processes, I would say that the NOD is just documenting the finding of the process.
Yeah, so an M&D is one 30-day review period for the public to provide comments, in addition to when the project comes in front of the Planning Commission. But, and then Trevor, next slide. Whereas in the EIR process, there's two required review periods. One is when the NOD, or sorry, excuse me, the NOP is out for public circulation. That is a 30-day required public review period. It's basically saying, hey, this is notice, we're preparing a CEQA document. Please start paying attention, provide any thoughts. Oftentimes, an initial study accompanies the NOP. And then the EIR will be prepared. It is called a draft EIR, but it doesn't mean it's draft because it's going to then have a more final, I don't want to use the word final,
yeah.
there's a final EIR.
The nomenclature is somewhat misleading to the public that doesn't understand. The nomenclature of draft doesn't mean that it's not available for consumption. It is just simply saying that this is the draft document. So if you're trying to go look up a document, public, don't go look for the final. The final is not going to have all the information in it. The draft is going to have all the analysis. And so the draft is simply what is identified in the statute because it does not become finalized until we consider the public input and comment that comes through the draft process.
Right, so you prepare the NOP and the initial study. You determine that the EIR is needed, so you prepare the draft EIR, and that draft EIR is circulated for a required 45 days, which is the second opportunity for the public to provide input. Oftentimes, especially on large controversial projects, during the NOP, there's a scoping meeting as well, so that's another opportunity for the public to provide comment, as well as commissioners. And then the project and the CEQA document will come to the Planning Commission. So that'll be the fourth opportunity to provide comment.
And just as you were mentioning earlier, some of your comments were about how to engage and when to engage. It's really important to understand that when the draft document is released, providing a comment in the record is a great opportunity to engage in that process. And statutorily, the lead agency is required to respond to those questions which are related to the topical resource considerations in the document. Not necessarily just opinion-based narrative like, I don't like this project or I don't want it on this side of town. But if you provide a technical comment on one of the resource topics, it has to be addressed in the final as part of the response to comments.
Yeah, so we've worked on projects that have been very complex EIRs that have received maybe 4 public comments. And we've worked on simpler projects that have an EIR. This one just received like 860 comments. And that's a lot to go through and provide technical responses to, but it's part of the process.
Or we've worked on projects to where it's resulted in state legislation that is in one of the larger cities in California. But anyway,
Yes.
We'll move on. So
talk about that one.
maybe the differences that I'll highlight related to EIRs versus M&Ds, because the documents, although the questions and the resource considerations may be the same, there are other considerations in EIRs that are not in NDs, partially because of the type of document in which you're preparing. So in a EIR, you're going to have an alternatives analysis, which comes out of the resource analysis. You have to identify ways to reduce impacts through developing project alternatives. Say you have a project that is potentially going to convert a bunch of ag land for housing, let's say. And one way that you could reduce that impact to ag land is to reduce the number of homes that you might be proposing. So you would develop an alternative to try to reduce the significant level of impacts. But you're not going to see that type of analysis in a mitigated negative declaration. Similarly, you're not going to see a robust cumulative analysis or a discussion about growth inducement, or there's a topical resource section in the statute for significant irreversible effects that's required to be in EIRs that's not required to be in NDs. So they are not similar in the level of detail of the type of document. Getting into kind of the next part, which is thresholds. So some of the conversation that we had earlier was about kind of the technical accuracy related to and analysis that goes into environmental review documents. Thresholds of significance and guidance documents are prepared by resource agencies for lead agencies to follow. So for example, a resource agency which is important in California might be your air district. So whether it's the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District or BACMUD, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, they have analytical methodologies in which we have to follow in analyzing certain project typologies and present the information in a specific way. Why do we have to do that? Because you might decide on the entitlements for the project, but if it's approved, then they might have to go get a permit from that resource agency, and they're going to rely on your document for them to issue that permit. So certain things you have control over how you prepare the document, and other resources the resource agencies do.
But even, and that's no matter the type of document, it doesn't change if it's an EIR or an MND.
Mitigation. Mitigation is an interesting context related to projects because certain mitigation is very tangible. I impact a half an acre of a wetland. I have to go buy 3 acres of credits, and it's very numerical. And there's a bank, and you pay a fee. Other mitigation can get very creative and interpretive depending upon its effectiveness. I always like to talk about travel demand management plans. You might have a travel demand management plan for a grocery store, and it says, oh, hey, we're going to try to reduce the amount of trips or the air emissions that might come out of it by providing electrical vehicle charging, or maybe there's a shuttle program, or maybe you can provide an e-bike. And the reduction of trip credits that goes into a TDMP might vary by lead agency depending upon what their regional transportation agency guidance is. So say you do a bike project in San Francisco that shows that you get a reduction of 10 trips when you do a retail store by providing e-bike parking or something like that. That's not necessarily going to be as effective in a community like Brentwood. The joke I always say is like, no one rides a bike to Costco, right? Like, no one's riding their bike to take home toilet paper to Costco.
That's actually not true. When we had Costco in here, we had the bike community was well represented and was insisting on parking. Thank you.
Appreciate the comment. The reality of utilizing that as a trip reduction method is what I'm referring to related to the analysis. It's not that community members can't participate in it. It's just you can't use it as a rationale for saying, oh, Costco's not going to generate trips because people will ride, a significant amount of people would ride their bikes there, right? What you need to know is kind of maybe non-planners in the process is that all the details in these studies flow through the environmental review in one facet or another. And it's through the application and development process in which we identify the details that feed through this. So for example, you might have project population that's used in the population housing section that's also reutilized in the transportation section, in the public services, recreation, and utilities. That's all the same number. It has 5 different outcomes that result from the analytical methods. And your staff oftentimes will work with the applicants to try to make sure that all those documents align. Anyone want to cover this one?
Sure. So why are planners so particular? As we've kind of been talking all night, the devil's in the details. So it's our job to manage the information. So to some of the comments earlier, what happens when maybe a developer brings information to the table, or how do we know, how does the city know, how do you know that the information that's being presented to you is valid information? So it's our job to understand the modeling assumptions, the construction schedule, construction equipment. There's different assumptions depending on the time of year. There's different assumptions depending on the equipment used, operational conditions, the hours of day, or noise, for example. Maybe your city has a requirement that quiet hours are after 10 p.m., right? So stuff like that. It's our job to pay attention to the details to help then present a document that accurately reflects the project and the environmental impacts associated with that project.
For those that are at home and following, there's an association called the California Association of Environmental Professionals, which generates an updated version of the CEQA guidelines and statutes. They actually they change every year with modifications from our legislature or case law, and there's actually case law summaries that are provided. You can go to this link and actually download a searchable PDF copy, which I would encourage all of the commissioners to do, because if you ever have a question about it, just Control find something and it'll give you kind of a summary on it. It's a really great resource for you to utilize.
Yeah, I use my book probably 5 times a day.
Yeah.
Like my hard copy.
Now, there was some specific requests from staff that we cover a couple pieces of recent legislation. And I know that you were going to try to cover most of these, but I'll kind of get us started off
Yes.
with SB 330. So if you haven't heard from your staff, which I'm sure you have, SB 330 kind of went into effect in 2020, and it establishes kind of regulations related to facilitating specifically housing projects and offers kind of a streamlined review and environmental evaluation related to those. There are specific provisions in which certain types of projects don't fall underneath this. That's would be, for example, like demolition of housing units, et cetera. So we'll continue to cover this one. The Housing Accountability Act is another one that we wanted to quickly make sure that you're aware of. So it basically prohibits an agency from disapproving particular housing project if it complies with the agency's applicable general plan and design standards. So if a project comes in and says, hey, I checked all the boxes and we meet all the requirements, some of your discretion is incredibly limited because of this law, right? And as part of that, it also means that the downzoning that's associated sometimes with projects, say you have a general plan that says this parcel has the potential to generate 20 units, and that's your assumption. If a project comes in with 10 units per your housing element, you also have to find out how you're going to accommodate those 10 units in some other location. Maybe it's another site in your housing element or some other site throughout your entire city. That's the no net loss provision associated with that.
And then I was going to say the last slide is just a list of reading recommendations that we like. Trevor, I know you have a favorite.
Yeah.
I'm trying
So
to find
I'd
it.
say it's the, where is it? The Golden Gates book. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the first one.
Yep. So if you haven't, this is a Bay Area-centric book. It actually highlights the city of Lafayette, where Anna is a planning commissioner. It talks about kind of the struggles of community planning in the Bay Area and the dialogue between state legislature and community. So it's a pretty quick read and it's unique to the Bay Area. So I figured everyone would like that. Some of these are kind of quintessential planning books. So if you're looking for some recommendations, take a look at this list. If you're a podcast person, send me a message and I'm happy to send you some podcasts or audiobooks too. Yeah. And I think with that, we're happy to take any further questions that the commission has in regards to the training or anything else that you might have
Or any public
consideration.
comments.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that great presentation. Commissioner Spalding?
Just a question, I don't know if you can answer this, or if council wants you to answer this question. And that is there's a recent court ruling around SB 9, and I know the cities that are involved, I believe, are all charter cities. Could be wrong on that, but what impact is that going to have, or how long will that impact take to roll out to a non-charter city, if at all?
Some of it's already hitting charter cities, non-charter cities. And what I would say is that there is a full spectrum of how communities are implementing SB 9. Actually, the case study for what the state would consider to be the most effective use, which means a higher level of density of actually producing housing in a very quick manner. That's the state's kind of definition. The city of San Diego has a pretty interesting program. They're basically doing vertical mixed-use developments under SB 9. So you're seeing 10, 12 unit projects happening on single-family lots because they're utilizing the 4 split associated with SB 9.
I would just note too that for our purposes and the city attorney's office purposes, we're still of the opinion that that opinion applies to charter cities, and we're going to wait and see unless and until, a general law city challenges that ruling, then, it could be generally applicable. But right now, it's just at the trial court as well. So we have a bit of a ways to go before
SB9 is thrown out the window.
Commissioner Johnson, any questions?
None at this time.
Commissioner Floyd?
None at this time.
Okay, well, I just want to thank you for a great presentation. I was sharing with your colleague earlier that I've been through this would probably be my 5th one while being on commission. And by far, this was probably the best one because it was so clear and we were able to participate. You weren't reading from slides, but you really did do us a great justice here. So thank you for the time you put in. We appreciate it.
Appreciate the kind words. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that said,
Yeah, through the chair, we want to open it up for any public comment through Zoom
Yes.
since no one's in the audience, just as we conclude here.
public comments?
Just to confirm, there's no hands raised in Zoom and there's no one here in chambers.
Okay, very good. All right. Having none, seeing none, we're going to move on to informational reports from committees and upcoming meeting schedules. Transplan? Commissioner Brand is not here, so we can't speak on that. Design review
We had no meeting.
and land use, we've had none either. Requests for future agenda items, are there any? Commissioner Spalding?
Yeah, I would like us to have a future agenda item in regards to the 300-foot notification. And my reasoning is I had to recuse myself because I lived inside 1,000 feet from a project because it could have financial gain for the result or denial of that project. To me, it seems like the notification should, if I can possibly be financially impacted in a positive or negative way by a project, it seems to me that we should be following the same thing for public notification for projects. So that's, I'd like to be able to have a discussion about on whether the rest of the commission would like to look into what it would take to change and match those two distances.
Okay.
Can I just
Commissioner?
clarify one thing? Because at the last meeting, we had talked about Commissioner Johnston's request on the signs that go up for public hearings. So your request is very specific to the distance or the radius that we incorporate to provide the notice. That's the only aspect that you want to look at?
Yeah, this is not, yeah.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. At this time, the next regular Planning Commission meeting is scheduled for June 4th at 7 p.m. I look forward to hearing a motion for adjournment.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Travel safely and have a happy Memorial Weekend.
June 4th. I might not be here on June the 4th. Oops.